can say that the recent sightings are in no way connected with any secret development by any department of the United States. However, there have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers.
Decades, not just the last 10 years. Before, to put this in perspective,
are these private companies you're implying, or is this non-human intelligence?
It may be both.
Okay.
When it comes to Blue Force Technologies, I would not be able to discuss.
Okay.
Since the early 2000s, we have seen an increasing number of unauthorized and or unidentified aircraft or objects in military-controlled training areas and training ranges and other designated airspace. Reports of sightings are frequent and continuing. For example, let me share with you the first video that we have here today, which shows an observation in real time.
Has the government conducted secret UAP crash retrieval programs, yes or no?
Yes.
Okay, were they designed to identify and reverse engineer alien craft, yes or no?
Yes.
Does the U.S. government have any reverse, okay, we already answered that question about retrieval programs. Do any U.S. contractors have the same?
I would prefer to address that in a closed session, ma'am.
In your book, you mentioned government employees who've been injured by UAPs, placed on leave, and receiving government compensation for their injuries. Is that correct?
That is correct.
How can the government deny we have recovered craft if they're paying people because they've been injured by recovered craft?
Ma'am, that's a great question. That's why I think we're here again, because I've seen the documentation by the U.S. government.
Are aliens real?
They're real, but I haven't seen them, and they're not being kept in, what is it?
Area 51?
Area 51. There's no underground facility, unless there's this enormous conspiracy, and they hid it from the President of the United States.
What was the first question you wanted answered when you became president?
Where are the aliens?
Where are the aliens?
In fact, recently, I received a call from a senior naval aviator with over 2,000 flight hours. He called me personally from the flight line after landing to talk about an encounter that he had just experienced.
Are you read into secret UAP crash retrieval programs?
We would have to have a conversation in a closed session, ma'am. I signed documentation 3 years ago that restricts my ability to discuss specifically crash retrievals. I submitted for my book through the DOPSR process, which took a year for it to be reviewed. And what is in the book is what I was told I'm allowed to talk about.
Has the government conducted...
There it was. Since the release of that preliminary report, the UAP Task Force database has now grown to contain approximately 400 reports. In this video, U.S. Navy personnel recorded what...
Something really strange is happening. Not in one country, not in one generation, and not only in our time. For centuries, people have reported strange lights, unusual objects, and encounters they could not explain. Now, most of those reports were dismissed. Many were forgotten, but they never disappeared. And now a mystery once pushed to the fringes has returned to the center of public attention. And the question is why? Why do these stories continue to surface generation after generation? Why do reports separated by decades, continents, cultures sound strangely familiar? And why, after all this time, are so many people still asking the same questions? Today, governments are discussing it, military pilots are discussing it, scientists are discussing it, news organizations are discussing it, and perhaps most surprising of all, average, ordinary, everyday people are also discussing it. Teachers, police officers, veterans, church members, mothers, fathers, people with careers, families, and reputations who have nothing to gain by speaking publicly about it. In fact, truth be told, most of these people have everything to lose by speaking publicly about it. Some claimed to have witnessed lights that moved in a strange or impossible way. Others describe objects that appeared suddenly and then vanished just as quickly. Many aren't claiming to know what they saw. They're simply describing experiences they've never been able to explain. And that's exactly where the investigation begins. Not with conclusions, not with speculation, not with sensational headlines, but with a question. What exactly are people seeing? Because the deeper I looked into this subject, the stranger things became. What began as a modern mystery led me into historic newspaper archives, government records, military reports, eyewitness testimonies, ancient accounts, and a trail of questions stretching much farther into the past than what I had expected. Now, there are some researchers who point to ancient carvings, paintings, and artifacts who argue that humanity has been recording unusual phenomena for thousands of years. However, some strongly disagree. But one thing is undeniable. People have been asking these questions for a very long time. So what on earth is going on? Or maybe I should say, what otherworldly event is going on? Why have these reports persisted for generations, and why do they refuse to disappear? And how come, despite all of our advances in science and technology, does this mystery seem just as alive today as ever? Before we go any further, I want to be clear with you about something. This series is not an attempt to tell you what to believe. It's not an attempt to prove to you or convince you that all of these stories are true. It's not an attempt to promote fear. It's an investigation, an examination of the records, the witnesses, the claims, the history, and the questions that refuse to disappear. Because whether these reports ultimately have ordinary explanations, extraordinary explanations, or something in between, one fact remains. The mystery continues, and so do those who believe they have experienced it. Tonight we begin where every investigation should begin, not with the answers, but with the questions.
My question is for Mr. Nelson. You said at the beginning of the meeting that that NASA will be transparent. Well, a month and a half ago, Mr. David Grush said under oath in Congress that the U.S. government is in possession of UAPs and extraterrestrial life. How can you be sure at NASA that other parts of the U.S. government is being transparent?
I don't speak for other parts of the government, but I can tell you NASA, which I speak for, is open and transparent with our data.
Do you believe what Mr. David Grush said, or is he lying?
You would want me to give a personal opinion?
Yes, please.
Of what he said. What he said, if I recall having seen this on the nightly news, was that he had a friend that knew where a warehouse was that had an UFO locked up in a warehouse. He also said he had another friend that said that he had parts of an alien. Whatever he said, where's the evidence? Is my response.
Excuse me. He also said that he did interview over 40 employees at the Pentagon.
For decades, reports of strange objects in the sky were often dismissed. People who came forward risked ridicule. Many remained silent. Others simply stopped talking. Yet the reports never completely disappeared. Generation after generation, stories continued to surface. Pilots, military personnel, police officers, farmers, teachers, ordinary people claiming they had witnessed something they could not explain. Then, something changed. A conversation that had spent decades on the fringe suddenly moved into the mainstream. News organizations began reporting on the subject. Government agencies acknowledged investigations. Military videos were released to the public. Congressional hearings drew national attention. Questions that once seemed confined to late-night radio shows were suddenly being discussed in government buildings. For some people, that change brought validation. For others, it raised even more questions. Why now? Why are governments discussing this openly? Why are trained military personnel willing to speak publicly? Why are reports continuing to emerge from around the world? And perhaps most importantly, why do so many accounts share similar themes despite being separated by years, decades, and sometimes even continents? The deeper I looked into the subject, the more I discovered that the mystery was far older than I had imagined. This wasn't a modern phenomenon. It wasn't born with the internet. It did not begin with smartphones, and it certainly didn't begin with social media. In fact, some of the most fascinating reports appeared long before any of those things existed. Long before modern technology, long before modern aviation, long before mankind ever walked on the moon. The trail stretches backward through time. Some researchers point to ancient carvings, paintings, and artifacts from civilizations such as Egypt and Mesopotamia, arguing that humanity has been documenting unusual phenomena for thousands of years. Others strongly disagree with those interpretations, suggesting many of these images have more conventional explanations. What remains beyond dispute is that people have been asking these questions for a very long time. Whether recorded in ancient stone, medieval artwork, historical newspapers, military reports, or modern eyewitness testimony, the mystery itself has persisted across generations. And that trail leads us somewhere unexpected, into dusty archives, forgotten headlines, historic records, and reports that most people have never seen. Because if we're going to understand why people are talking about this now, we first need to understand how long they've been talking about it. And that story begins more than a century ago. One of the most surprising discoveries I made during this investigation had nothing to do with modern technology. It had nothing to do with social media. It had nothing to do with government hearings. In fact, it was not modern at all. The deeper I dug into historical records, the more I realized that reports of strange objects in the sky stretch back much farther than most people realize. Long before smartphones, long before satellites, long before radar, long before airplanes, people were already reporting things they could not explain. As I searched through old newspaper archives, I found story after story describing unusual lights, mysterious objects, and strange aerial sightings. Some reports came from large cities. Others came from remote rural communities. Many of the witnesses had never met one another. Many lived hundreds or even thousands of miles apart. And yet some of their descriptions sound remarkably familiar. In the late 1800s, newspapers across the United States carried stories about mysterious airships. Witnesses described strange craft moving across the sky. Some accounts described lights. Others described objects hovering silently. Some reports were likely exaggerations. Some may have been misunderstandings. Some may never be fully explained. But the reports themselves are real. The headlines are real. The witnesses were real. And they leave us with an important question. Why were people reporting these things decades before modern UFO culture ever existed? As the 20th century unfolded, the reports continued. Newspapers carried stories of unusual lights. Military personnel occasionally documented unexplained observations. Pilots reported encounters they struggled to identify. Again and again, reports surfaced, then faded, then surfaced once more. Sometimes the stories made national headlines. Other times they disappeared almost as quickly as they appeared. Yet the pattern never completely vanished. Generation after generation, people continued to look upward and wonder, what did they see? What caused these reports? Were they observing natural phenomena? Experimental technology? Misidentifications? Something entirely unknown? The truth is that many of these questions remain unanswered, and perhaps that is why the subject continues to capture the imagination. Not because we have all the answers, but because we do not. Because hidden within dusty archives and forgotten newspaper pages is evidence of something undeniable. For more than a century, people have been asking the same questions, and they're still asking them today. The mystery did not begin with us. We simply inherited it. And as this investigation continued, another pattern began to emerge. A pattern that moved beyond headlines and historical records. A pattern that touched something much deeper. Because throughout history, many people have interpreted unusual events in the sky through a very different lens. Not a scientific one, not a political one, a spiritual one. As this investigation continued, I began noticing something unexpected. The mystery wasn't limited to newspaper archives, it wasn't limited to military reports, and it wasn't limited to modern eyewitness accounts. The deeper I looked, the more I discovered that throughout history, people have often interpreted unusual events through a very different lens, a spiritual one. For thousands of years, human beings have looked into the heavens and asked questions. Questions about what exists beyond our world. Questions about what may exist beyond our understanding. Questions about whether or not we are truly alone. Ancient civilizations recorded unusual events in the sky. Ancient texts described encounters with beings that appeared suddenly and disappeared just as quickly. Stories emerged from cultures separated by oceans, languages, and continents. Yet many of them shared remarkably similar themes. Lights, messengers, beings descending from above, warnings, encounters, fear, wonder, and questions. Many people today immediately divide into two camps. One camp assumes every report has a physical explanation. The other assumes every report has a supernatural explanation. But what if the truth is more complicated than either side even realizes? What if some reports have ordinary explanations while others do not? What if the mystery itself is even larger than the labels that we place upon it? Throughout history, different cultures have interpreted unexplained events according to their understanding of the world around them. What one generation called a sign, another generation called an omen. What one generation called an angel, another called a messenger. What one generation called a wonder in the heavens, another attempted to explain through science. The names changed, the questions remained. And perhaps that is what makes this subject so fascinating. Not because everyone agrees, but because they don't. The debate continues generation after generation, civilization after civilization, century after century, the same questions continue to echo through history. What are people seeing? What are they experiencing? And why do so many reports seem to touch something deeper than a simple sighting in the sky? As I continued receiving emails from people across the country, I noticed something else. Many of the stories were not merely descriptions of objects. They were deeply personal experiences. Experiences that affected the people who lived through them. Experiences they often struggled to explain. Experiences they sometimes carried for years before telling anyone else. And that brings us to the next chapter of this investigation. Because behind every report is a person, a witness, a story. And for many of them, speaking publicly is far more difficult than seeing the event itself. The witnesses begin. Every investigation eventually reaches a point where history and theory give way to something more personal. People. Because behind every report is a human being, a witness, a story, a moment that changed someone's life. Over the last several months, I have received emails from people across the country. Many of them have never spoken publicly about their experiences. Some were hesitant even to send an email. Others waited years before telling anyone what they believed they had seen. One thing became clear very quickly. These weren't people seeking attention. Many were actually afraid of attention, afraid of ridicule, afraid of being dismissed, afraid that friends, family members, coworkers, or church communities might think differently of them. And yet many felt compelled to speak anyway, not because they wanted fame or attention, but because they wanted answers. One person described years of unusual observations near a military installation. Another described witnessing lights that appeared to move in ways they could not explain. Others described experiences that left them with more questions than answers. Not everyone agreed on what they had seen. Not everyone interpreted their experiences the same way. But they all shared one thing in common. They were searching for the truth. As I read through these accounts, I noticed something important. They did not know what they had witnessed. They were not claiming certainty. They were describing experiences, and there's a difference. A person can honestly describe what they experienced without claiming to understand it. That distinction matters. Because throughout this investigation, one of the most consistent themes has not been certainty. It has been mystery, questions, uncertainty, people trying to make sense of events they do not fully understand. One message came from an individual who described seeing unusual activity near an Air Force base. The experience stayed with them for years. Another described an event so unusual that they struggled to explain it even to themselves. Several witnesses expressed the same concern. I know how this sounds. That phrase appeared again and again. I know how this sounds. Perhaps because many witnesses understand the stigma attached to the subject. They understand that extraordinary claims invite skepticism. And perhaps skepticism is healthy. Extraordinary claims should be examined carefully. Questions should be asked. Evidence should be evaluated. Assumptions should be challenged. But none of those things require us to ignore the witnesses themselves. Because whether every report proves to be significant or not, the people behind these stories are real. Their experiences are real. Their questions are real. And their desire for answers is real. As more emails arrived, a larger picture slowly began to emerge. Not a conclusion, not a final answer, a pattern. A growing collection of accounts from ordinary people who believed they had encountered something unusual, and that raises a question that cannot be ignored. If these experiences are indeed happening, what are people actually seeing? And perhaps even more importantly, how should we investigate these claims responsibly? Because in the next chapter of this investigation, we begin looking more closely at the evidence, the witnesses, and the questions that continue to surface. Questions that will challenge assumptions on every side of this debate. At the beginning of this investigation, I thought I was exploring a single question. What are people seeing? But the deeper I looked, the more I realized that one question leads to many other questions. Questions about history, questions about government investigations, questions about eyewitness testimony, questions about belief, questions about evidence, questions about the unknown. Some people believe every report can be explained. Others believe some reports point to something far beyond our current understanding. Between those positions lies a landscape filled with uncertainty, a place where evidence, experience, history, and interpretation often collide. And that is where this investigation will continue. In the coming episodes, we will examine eyewitness testimony in greater detail. Not anonymous headlines, not rumors, real people, real experiences, real questions. We will examine military encounters that continue to generate debate, government records that have fueled decades of speculation, historic reports that stretch back far beyond the modern era, and the striking similarities that appear in accounts separated by time, geography, and culture. We will also explore a question that many investigators avoid entirely. Why do so many witnesses describe experiences that seem to touch something deeper than just a simple observation in the sky? For some, the subject is purely physical. For others, it appears connected to something spiritual. Perhaps the answer is simpler than many believe. Perhaps it is more complex. That is what we intend to investigate, not with fear, not with sensationalism, but with curiosity, careful examination, and a willingness to ask difficult questions. Because regardless of where this investigation ultimately leads, one thing has become clear. The mystery is not going away. People continue to report unusual experiences. Questions continue to surface and answers remain elusive. Perhaps that is why the subject continues to capture the imagination of millions. Not because we know what it is, but because we don't. And maybe the most important question is not whether the mystery exists, because the mystery clearly exists. The question is, what are we willing to do with it? Will we ignore it? Will we ridicule it? Will we blindly accept every claim? Or will we investigate it honestly? That journey begins right here. And this is only the beginning. In the next episode, we begin examining the witnesses themselves, their stories, their experiences, and the events that convinced them something extraordinary had taken place. Until then, keep asking questions, because sometimes the search for truth begins with a mystery, and sometimes the mystery leads somewhere completely unexpected.
Mr. Bright, can you rerun that first image that looked like it was outside of a plane window? And if you wouldn't mind going up to the screen and tell us what we're seeing. Not that you can necessarily tell us what we're seeing, but explain what we should be looking at in that first image.
Is aircraft that is operating in a U.S. Navy training range that has observed spherical object in that area, and as they fly by it, they take a video. You see it looks reflective in this video, somewhat reflective, and it quickly passes by the cockpit of the aircraft.
And is this one of the phenomena that we can't explain?
I do not have an explanation for what this specific object is.
That's the object we're looking at right there now, right?
That's it right there.
Okay. Last year's report also said that of those 144, 18 of them reportedly appeared to exhibit unusual flight characteristics, appear to demonstrate advanced technology, and some of them appeared to remain stationary in winds aloft, move against the wind, maneuver abruptly, or move at considerable speed without discernible means of propulsion. That's pretty intriguing. And if you're able to answer this in this setting, are we aware of any foreign adversary capable of moving objects without any discernible means of propulsion?
I think I would, without discernible means of propulsion, I would say that we're not aware of any adversary that can move an object without discernible means of propulsion.
There are other people besides the U.S. that have had these experiences and reported them. Is that correct?
There are. That's correct. Allies have seen these. China has established its own version of a UAP task force. So clearly, a number of countries have observations of things in the airspace that they can't identify.
It's not beyond the realm of possibility that there is some exploration coming here, that people think there must be extraterrestrial life, and it's not at all beyond the pale that there would be a visit here.
So there are elements in our government that are engaged in looking for life in other places, and they have been doing that for decades. Right? They've been searching for extraterrestrial life.
Under the category of UAP appear to demonstrate advanced technology, those 18 incidents in which some of the UAP appear to remain stationary, winds aloft, move against the wind, maneuver abruptly, or move at considerable speed without discernible means of propulsion. It goes on to say, in a small number of cases, military aircraft systems processed radio frequency energy associated with UAP sightings.